Hi, everyone. Today on Cattlemen Talk, we will be discussing different things regarding market formulation in the cattle industry. Recently, the Oregon Cattlemen's Association has wrote a letter to USDA recommending amendments to the livestock mandatory reporting program. And there is a concept in there called 3014. You also may have heard of a concept called 5014, which is something we'll discuss in a little bit. But today I want to talk to someone who was involved in writing that letter and has a little bit more experience as far as the markets go. So today we're talking to John Levy. He is the Oregon Cattlemen's Association's new marketing chair. John, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
You bet, Robin. Thank you for having me. I'm a fourth generation rancher from Pendleton, Oregon. I went to school at Eastern Oregon University and got my degree there in range management. And I started working for the stockyards there in La Grande, Oregon, Intermountain Livestock, when I was a junior in college. And when I graduated as a senior, they offered me a full-time job as a field rep countryman. And I've been there ever since now, going on a decade there, just over a decade there full-time, getting to work with these producers in Northeast Oregon and around the region. So we've there at Intermountain Livestock, like a lot of the sale barns around Oregon, we're a competitive marketplace and like the competitive auction method, and that's what we like to do. And so I got my start early there, back home on the ranch, and my family runs a mother calf deal and a stocker feeder deal also, and so I've gotten to see not a lot of experience in all the facets of the industry, but I've gotten to see enough of them.
I'm assuming you've seen markets fluctuate throughout the years. What has been happening particularly lately that is making the market so volatile?
A big part, the coronavirus is the hot topic. It's affecting all the markets, obviously. But, the big thing in the beef right now was at the beginning of the coronavirus, we had all these purchasing at the grocery stores and retailers. And that started to make this meat move higher. And which was great. Consumers were clearing off those beef shelves in the supermarkets, and that's great. And then as this coronavirus the testing started to expand, they started to find this coronavirus in these packing houses pretty heavy, testing all the employees. And so these packing houses have had to shut down and clean and come up with new rules and regulations of how they're going to operate to protect employees. And so the bottleneck right now that's really creating a lot of havoc in the beef industry is these fat cattle backing up in these feedlots with no place to go, and these reduced kills, harvest every week, are being really hard on us right now, and that's what's causing a lot of the pain right now. That being said, with the price of meat so high, these packers want to harvest these cattle and want to get through some of these cattle, and we're starting to see these harvests come back from their lows, and with these elevated prices, these packers will want to pull on inventory. And so that can be a positive that does come out of it. So.
Well, yeah, good. It's unfortunate, the backup. I've heard over 1 million head almost right now. So
and the government's got kind of a cold storage program for those fed cattle where producers can enroll them, I think, for a certain amount of days, and the government's going to pay a percentage or their entire ration to kind of cold store those fed cattle, and that's great. But at some point, they have to go into the system, and so the quicker these packers can get back up and going, the more it helps everybody for sure. So,
to the letter, how did the formulation come about? Writing the letter, who was in the discussion, and what was the purpose of this letter?
The purpose of the letter was to show support for the 30-14 minimum rule. And what it would do, Robin, is it would require these packers. It's not a price mandate. I mean, mandate's a scary word. Everybody in the beef industry likes their freedoms and likes to operate independently, and we're all independent people, and we all like to be our own bosses. And mandate's a big, scary word. But this mandate is just a mandate, basically, of where these packers can source and how these packers source cattle is what it comes down to. So the 30 part of that 30-14 letter is that on a weekly basis that these packers must be harvesting 30% of their negotiated cash cattle. So and that's spot trade, and that the 14 part is those cattle must deliver within 2 weeks. And so that's a negotiated cash, what would be considered a spot trade with those cattle coming right away. And, you know, a big part of what people don't hear about and why I think it's so important, me personally, is, you know, as somebody who watches the futures markets day in and day out, year round, is that spot live cattle trade is a huge part of what moves live cattle futures. And until somebody can get that changed or wants to change live cattle futures, this is the hand we're dealt. And, you know, one pen of 500 head in the northern plain states with a higher trade can make the board move higher. The same can be said for 500 head of plainer cattle in the southern plains that puke up for $5 cheaper than the week prior. They'll tank the futures market. So we've got to find a way to get more transparency in these markets, and a mandate of where these packers can source these cattle from and how they source them will help with the transparency and pricing for all cattle producers. You know, right now we've got a June live cattle board at just under 99 cents or right around 99 cents. And these fed cattle right now are trading from 115 to 120. And those are supposed to come together before that June board expires. So, you know, I mean, there's all kinds of problems and disconnect right now. And a lot of it's due to the coronavirus and things that are happening. These packers have ponied up a little bit. These packers are making so much money that they don't have a lot of choice than to kind of keep a floor under this deal right now, to keep looking good also. So
I do think there is a little bit of a silver lining in the coronavirus issues that have been going on, because it's really brought a lot of light to the cattle markets and how cattle are processed and how the beef supply chain works. So that's very interesting.
Warren Buffett's got a great quote, Robin, and he says, and I'm sure I'll butcher it up, but he says, you only find out who's swimming naked when the tide goes out. And right now the tide's out.
Yeah.
We're seeing more about what's going on and who's making all the money and some of these things that are going on. And the tide's gone out far enough now that the media finally can see what's happening.
Right.
And a lot of the people, you know, we're getting more, it sure feels like we're getting more credit now, or not necessarily credit, but we're getting more looks from the higher ups in this country than we've ever got.
Mm-hmm.
And just that awareness from consumers all the way to the top of this country, I think is great for all parts of the beef business, for sure.
Yeah. So for someone who doesn't understand market lingo or terminology, could you explain? I know there's several different types of market trade formulations, such as negotiated, forward contracting. Could you kind of go into the differences and what specifically this letter, the 30% part, is looking for?
Right. Well, the three main marketings are going to be forward contracting, grid formula, and this negotiated cash. And right now, the negotiated cash, so everybody knows, is hovering in the low 20s. It varies annually, but is in the right now. Negotiated cash trade is the smallest trade year in, year out of what's happening. Probably, I haven't seen the numbers, but I would guess followed next by forward contracting, and then the majority of your cattle are grid formula cattle. And grid cattle, Robin, grid is, you know, cattle, you're getting paid for cattle, for individual carcasses is what you're doing. You're getting for cattle that hit certain yield grades, quality grades, hit those where those packers want them. And so they can either get more money for those carcasses or they can get less money. I'll just be honest, I don't quite understand a lot of the formula and parts of the grid for sure. I think a lot of that's proprietary depending on the packer and where they're located in the country and the relationships they have with big corporate feeders. There's a lot of that stuff we don't see and we won't see, that we're just not going to know. And that's why negotiated cash is something that we can see in front of us on a weekly basis. And it's why that negotiated cash is so important.
So I know that some other states, well, I guess this is a few different questions. Are there minimum requirements in other states right now? If so, is it 30%? Is it higher than 30%? Are there more states pushing for this minimum negotiated cash trade percentage?
There's a lot of support behind this 30-14, Robin. To each and individual state or organization, I'm not sure, I couldn't name them. This was kind of a grassroots movement, this 30-14. And there's another movement now of 50-14, where some people think that it should be 50% negotiated cash and that deliver within 14 days. So there's a couple different proposals out there. The Oregon Cattlemen's jumped on the 30-14. It was one of the first ones, no question. 30-14 was the first one. And in fact, I believe the 50-14 might have been introduced by a couple senators, maybe even. Anyway, but this 30-14 is not a maximum. It's a bare minimum. And if the powers that be decide it needs to be more than that, well, that's great. We thought 30-14 was important, Robin, because there's a lot of these packing plants that are at zero negotiated cash trade every week. You get a lot of some of these big corporate feeders, and they probably haven't traded negotiated cash or minimal for years now. So it's going to be pretty tough for those guys to get to 50. And I think that's where a lot of this 30 came about. So
30 was a more realistic.
Right. And, in my opinion, not an opinion of the Oregon Cattlemen's, but just my opinion, is that what I see is you look at that number now and say, okay, last year we averaged 22% throughout the whole course of the year. That doesn't tell the whole story. Some weeks it might have been 30 or 35% negotiated cash trade, and other weeks it might have been 10 or 15%. But that level of uncertainty and with no mandate, that's part of how these packers can use that as their control. From week maybe the futures market's higher one week, and these packers maybe don't necessarily need the extra cattle. They can kind of sit on their hands and wait till that board breaks. And once they have that board broke, well, then they can step up. And so one week on higher prices might show negotiated cash at 10 to 15%, and maybe some news or something breaks that board next week, and they buy them cheaper, a nickel cheaper, and they buy 30-35% negotiated cash. So the inconsistency, you can't just look at it. What I'm saying is you can't just look at an annual snapshot of negotiated trade and say we need to be higher. Negotiated trade, the inconsistencies in negotiated cash trade is part of the problem.
It sounds like it'll help level the playing field between what the packers, their fluctuations, and really give some more power back to the producer.
Right. Well, and you have to understand too, a lot of times now, Robin, that people are less concerned. There's a lot of people right now, I guarantee you, there's feeders who are less concerned about the price of the cattle, and they're more concerned with getting those cattle harvested. Mm-hmm. And in a lot of cases in the Northwest, for example, where we have limited packing capacity, a lot of these smaller feeders, they're just, they just want to kill slot, right? Mm-hmm. They just want them to take them when they're ready. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that can be pretty tough sledding. So anyway, more competition is always better. And we sure believe that 30-14 will help that. Robin, there's got to be some middle ground of where a cow-calf producer and a feeder and a packer can all kind of live and make a living and go on. Those packers can price that meat. They have a lot of control at their level. These big feeders, they're hedging cattle. They don't care what the cattle cost a lot of time. They just need to be hedgeable and can kind of work. These cow-calf producers are the same token. These cow-calf producers need money, real money for those calves every year. Or they're not going to be able to be here. So anyway.
Yeah. Any other last thoughts you'd like to add on?
I thought I'd just give you some things that are happening, some things that I'm watching, so other people can keep an eye on too, of kind of the latest and greatest. We know that harvest is coming back. That beef harvest slaughter is starting to come back, which is really positive. Carcass weights are way too heavy. I think yesterday that carcass weights year to date are 40 pounds heavier than a year ago, which is not good. So we're going to have to see what happens there. Hopefully in the next week or two, we'll start to see, as these packers start to increase capacity again, hopefully we'll start to see these carcass weights start to drop. That would be one of the things that would cause that to drop, which would be really good. And then these cutouts, these cutouts are at record highs, these choice box beef cutouts and select box beef cutouts. And I really thought that these packers would run them up there to a top, and then these cutouts would just collapse. And they have not just collapsed. These packers are maintaining this really high meat price in these boxed beef. To my surprise, a little bit, Robin. I thought with a big run up like that, usually what you see is you see a couple days where they just peel it off and really drop the price of meat. This meat's not really dropping very fast. And where that could be really beneficial to getting through some of these cattle is these packers will be making so much money that these packers will want to get up to whatever the new full capacity looks like and beyond to make as much money as possible. So there is some bright side to the packer making all the money here for a minute, possibly, to get through these, what some people say will be 1 million head of cattle or maybe more now or wherever we're at with it.
Mm-hmm.
But the one benefit to the packer making a lot of money is he will want to harvest and move that meat, and that will trickle down eventually and get back to the rancher. So anyway, so those are kind of some of the things that I'm watching and keeping an eye on, and I'm very surprised that they've been able to hold these elevated levels in this meat. And we'll, every day is a new day, and we'll see how things are going forward. So it's
every day is a new day, that's for sure. I've heard a lot of concern that in the fall is when we're really going to be seeing the impacts of this. Do you have any insight on?
Right. It's early on when I was starting to call around and was starting to watch this market drop. We've seen lots of market drops. The difference in this market drop was so severe is we didn't have it to give up in the first place. Robin, this isn't 2014-15 where six-weight calf was $2.50 a pound, and we can give up, a third of that and still be okay. We started from a lot lower place here on this drop. And that's where this cost of production on these producers is getting scary. And the one thing I told everybody, because I try and find the glass half full most of the time, is that the best part of the news right now is it's not October 1st. And there's a lot of these calves that are just now turning out to pasture, and they don't have to find a market right now or be marketed right now. These producers can go about their summer now and not have to worry about it. These backing up cattle is going to be really interesting to watch and see what happens here. The government's trying to provide some backstop right now, and we'll see how that plays out. But at the end of the day, there's still a lot of cattle, 1 million cattle backing up, let's call it. And at some point, they're going to have to go through the system. And how long will a federal backstop hold us and keep us there? And that ties back a little bit, Robin, to what you said. We've learned more about our industry than ever. The tide's out now. And we can see all this. These packers are making that kind of money, and we know that the consumer values our beef and wants our beef product. That we know there's no demand problems in the beef industry now after this deal for sure, and that people will pay. If they're worried about it, they'll pay whatever it costs to get it. So it'll be really interesting to watch. The fall is definitely something to be a little concerned about at the moment. But like I said, in this business, it seems like a lot of things that should wreck us actually improve things, and things that we think are going to be great for us sometimes wreck us. And I'll give an example of that. The Tyson packing fire last August for Tyson in Kansas there, we all thought was going to be, and it did for a while. We all thought it just was going to ruin us, and we'd never see another good day in our life. But after that, we actually, the next week or the week after, we actually harvested more cattle in this country with that plant down, with that 5,000-6,000 head plant down, because the meat shot up and these other packers wanted to capitalize on that extra money and start pulling on cattle. So like I said, there's a lot. It's a tough business. It's a complex business. But these packers making money right now is good for. We need these packers to be making some money right now to pull these cattle and get through these million cattle. But at the same token, back to the 3014, Robin, we've got to have something where we can get some more transparency in these markets to see what goes on and get some more transparency and get some more competition in these markets. There's nothing out there that's just, this is a terrible idea and here's why, plain and simple. I haven't seen it yet if it is. And I've kind of been looking. So the guys that like to sell their cattle grid and formula and forward contract, they can still do that. Those corporate feeders with their relationships with those packers, they can still do that. But we've got to get to a place where we've got more transparency and know what's going on and know what, know what these cattle are worth week in and week out.
All right, John. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and giving us more information about this. We're very lucky to have you on here at OCA, and hopefully we'll be talking to you again.
Thank you, Robin. Glad to be here.
Thanks for your work.